Good morning, everyone. I think we're able to begin with our only witness today, is Professor Peter Hawkey.
Yes, my lord.
Good morning, Professor.
Morning, Your Lordship.
Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh, who I think you've met.
Indeed.
But first, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes.
Sitting where you are, can I ask you to raise your right hand and repeat these words after me? I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, our timetable is that we would probably take most of the day with your evidence. We usually take a coffee break at 11:30, but, and can I emphasize this, if you want to take a break at any other time, for whatever reason, and we don't need to go into the reasons,
No.
just give me an indication and we'll take a break. So please feel that you're in control of the situation.
Thank you, Lordship.
Now, Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. Now, Professor, I'm going to take your full name.
Professor Peter Michael Hawkey.
And what's your current occupation?
I am a consultant microbiologist for the Scottish NHS looking after the Shetland Health Board, and I'm Chief Scientific Officer of Alcuranex Limited, a company dedicated to discovering new antibiotics against multi-resistant gram-negative bacteria.
Thank you. Now, you provided your CV attached to what we have colloquially referred to as the HAD report.
Yep.
Now, that's in bundle 44, volume 1, document 1 at page 153. Now, what we'll do is we'll put it on the screen, but, and I think it's worth observing that you'll need to tell me if when I put something on the screen isn't readable to you.
Yes.
We can zoom in to half pages as we go, but
Yeah.
I'm hoping that you're familiar with your CV.
I am pretty. Yes.
So what I'd like to understand is how you would describe your principal research interests.
Principal research has always been around gram-negative bacteria, and in fact my first research project on gram-negative bacteria was in 1980, the investigation of an outbreak in a ward caused by Providentia stewartii, multi-resistant organism. Thereafter, I have worked in the area of Clostridium difficile and MRSA, but if you look at my publications of 315 odd paid publications, 50% of those are on gram-negatives, and 17 or 18 will be descriptions, big papers on major outbreaks caused by multi-resistant gram-negative bacteria.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned your current role in Shetland.
Yes.
I think it's important to put it into context. So how many days a week do you work in
I work Mondays through to Wednesday lunchtime. I'm the infection control doctor and the consultant microbiologist for Shetland Health Board. I'm based out of Aberdeen, so they employ me but second me permanently to Shetland. I work from Norfolk remotely, and I'm responsible for all aspects, environmental and otherwise, of infection control.
So you are the only infection control doctor?
Yes, absolutely.
You don't have colleagues who are on the scene, as it were?
No, it's a role I don't mind doing because when I was head of everything in Birmingham, I was the principal infection control doctor for Birmingham teaching hospitals.
And so you are, along with the nurses, the IPC team in Shetland?
Absolutely, they're an integral part. We work very closely together.
Okay. Now, and you headed the IPC team in Birmingham?
Yes.
University. But which hospital was it in Birmingham again?
Initially, I worked at Heartlands Hospital, then the two trusts fused, so I then moved to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham.
Right.
Prior to that, when I was professor in Leeds, I was head of infection control and chair of the infection control committee for Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust.
And possibly one of your successors might be Professor Mark Wilcox?
In fact, I appointed him there as my senior lecturer when I was professor.
Right. Now, what I want to do is just identify your reports.
Yes.
I'll put them on the screen, but I'm sure you're familiar with them. The first one is what we have called the HAD report, which we're looking at. So we go to page 5, and that was produced jointly with Dr. Samir Agarwal and Professor Lydia Drumright. Am I right?
Correct.
Right. Then there's the response document, which is bundle 44, volume 5, document 2, page 20. And this was again produced jointly, but in
Yes,
July
correct.
of this year.
Yeah.
And then we sent you 2 questionnaires.
Yes.
The
Had
first-
one, had two.
You had questionnaire 1, which is bundle 44, volume 2, document 1, page 12. And that's in the form of a questionnaire and your answers, some of which are by you individually, some of which by Dr. Agarwal individually,
Yes.
some of which by Dr. Drumright, some of which are collective.
Correct.
And then a supplementary questionnaire from which the response document has almost sort of been spawned,
Yes.
is in bundle 44, volume 5, document 1, page 4. Now, are you willing to adopt these 4 documents as part of your evidence?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Now, if we can take that off the screen, what I want to do is to think about the division of labour within the HAD report project, primarily for the purpose of checking that I'm asking the right questions of the right person. Now, before I do that, did you watch or listen to the evidence of your colleagues, Dr. Agarwal and Dr. Drumright?
I did. I've seen almost both of their
Right.
evidences because it's important because we worked as an integrated team.
Fine. So, if we look at the report in its structure, probably actually helpfully by putting the index on the screen.
Yep.
If we go to page 12 of bundle 44, volume 1. Go to page 12. I'm not going to go this line by line, but I'll just have them on the screen for our and your. So if we put the executive summary to one side for a moment.
Yeah.
The introduction, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. To what extent are you the right person to ask questions about those?
I am the right person because I certainly wrote first drafts, which were then commented on by my colleague Dr. Agrawal to a degree, but I'm the principal author of those chapters. Correct.
Then if we go on to page 13, the water chapter, chapter 5, could it be that you're the principal author of that?
Sorry, page 13.
No, when I call out a page, I'm calling out a page for my colleagues.
Oh, I see. Okay, you got it at the top.
So chapter 5, water. Are you the principal author for that?
Yes, but I've also lent particularly on Dr. Agarwal in relation to any areas where that began to impinge on haematology oncology and his experience as a consultant physician.
Thank you. And then chapter 6, would that be large ventilation, would largely be him?
Totally him, really.
Totally him.
I mean, I made some comments, but he is the expert on ventilation.
And I'll ask my colleague to switch onto page 14 of the bundle. Now, if we look at chapter 7,
yeah.
Am I right in thinking that effectively it has 3 parts? It has 7.1.
Yeah.
Are the water testing results consistent with there being, quote, widespread contamination, close quote? A 7.2 epidemiology exercise involving bloodstream infection data.
Yes.
And on the next page of this document, 7.3, what does the available sequencing show?
Yes.
Would you be the right author for 7.1 and 7.3?
Absolutely. And my colleague, Dr. Drumright, of course, did all the data analysis and prepared drafts for us to consider and discuss of all of the epidemiological data.
I will still talk to you about that epidemiology.
Oh, yeah, naturally.
But mainly in the context of the results.
Yeah.
And then chapter 8, ventilation, is that primarily Dr. Agarwal's work?
Absolutely, correct.
Right. Well, take that off the screen. What I want to do is go back to, can we go to page 151 of that bundle? Now, this is a declaration.
Oh, yes.
Have you had previous experience of being an expert witness?
Yes, I've spent 35 years as a medical negligence expert witness mainly in the area of infection, obviously the infections, but also sometimes in relation to infection control.
Thank you. And presumably, therefore, you've come across declarations of this sort before?
Yes.
In
fact, the CLO said, would it be appropriate to put a declaration in there, because my duty is always to the court as an expert, and I regard that in this setting as the same sort of duty, to be unbiased and interpret the data as best
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about the nature of your duty to, in this case, the inquiry now. We've used, perhaps loosely, the question of the extent to which a expert is obliged to help the fact finder understand the questions they have to answer. Would you concur with that idea as part of what you're trying to do?
No, I'm not helping anyone. I'm looking, and this was our approach, was to look at an incident that had happened or a purported incident.
Right. Could I just take this
sorry.
at dictation speed?
So
Oh, sorry.
Right. You're
So
not.
I have a tendency. Sorry,
you're not
Lordship.
helping anybody.
No, my feeling here is my whole approach to this was really to understand what had happened as far as we could retrospectively from what information we either had or could, in some cases,
So my question,
suggest.
Professor Hawkey, sorry to cut across you, is do you understand your position to help the inquiry?
Oh, absolutely, because
Right.
you're seeking the truth,
Right. So
Well,
you...
if that can be sought.
Professor, you've just said you're not helping anybody.
Oh, I
So-
see. Sorry. I meant in terms of people who had instructed me, because the Central Legal Office obviously approached me and instructed me with various questions. Okay. And then in turn, they handed us on to yourselves. And you in turn posed questions to us. I wish to approach those in as unbiased a way as possible.
But how would you describe the extent to which it's your duty to help the inquiry,
Oh,
particularly, let me get to the end, particularly the chair, ultimately, to understand the issues
mhm.
and to reach conclusions on the issues that face that particular fact finder? How would you understand your duty in that area?
To look at data, to look at results and other people's reports and present an opinion, if necessary, sometimes explain some of the more complex areas, and to suggest what might have happened, what seems plausible or not plausible.
Thank you. Now, the next question.
Could I just,
Sorry, Lon.
in sort of teasing this out a little. Now, you do see your role as helping, I mean, to be frank, me.
Yes.
Right. Now, does that include the helping me, the way in which the report is set out and the material which is within that report?
Yes, and I mean, it's a highly technical area. Understanding bacteria is a whole new language of just how they're named, which is why CLO suggested, and I thought it was a reasonable suggestion, otherwise I wouldn't have taken it, would have taken them up on it, on putting in a section which was criticised in CNR of how are bacteria named. What are these different types of gram-negative bacteria? And that's why I wrote that section, which is for illustration and enlightenment.
That's chapter 3 we're talking about.
Yes, chapter 3.
Right, we may come to that, but your purpose was for enlightenment.
Exactly.
So, what I think is probably a good idea to do now is to look at your letter of instruction
Yes.
and just discuss some of the material. To be fair, you've already covered it in HAD Questionnaire 1.
Yep.
Which is for reference bundle 44, volume 2, document 1 at page 15. I'm not going to go through my questions because written questions are always phrased in a rather laborious way because you're not there to say, no, I didn't mean that. But let's look at the letter of instruction, bundle 44, volume 1, document 4, page 239. Now, just to put everything in context, when you were asked to get involved, was Dr. Agarwal already involved?
I was approached initially by somebody,
I don't think names matter in this context.
somebody in the health board who said, we've had this issue, which I wasn't aware of. We've had a series of reports, I think. About gram-negative bacteria, would I be prepared to provide an opinion on them? And I said, yes, I will. At that point, I had no further contact directly with Glasgow Health Board at all. And I was contacted by Dr. Rubello at CLO. We said, and you can see in this letter, but I said, well, it's obviously complex. I can deal with infection control and microbiology, but the clinical aspects are not my area, hematology, oncology. And he said they'd had some connection and work with Dr. Agrawal. Now, I know Dr. Agrawal not well, but prior to this, as a very good, competent hem-onc physician at Bath. And I said, that's fine. So at that point, we then got together to talk about how we might approach this problem.
Well, while we're mentioning Dr. Agrawal, I suppose a brief question. You would have heard me ask him questions about the extent he had expertise in pediatric hemato-oncology. Did that question of whether he had appropriate expertise to cover the whole scope of this investigation occur to you, or am I misunderstanding the nature of expertise?
No, obviously children from a pharmacological and a treatment point of view are very different to adults. They're not just mini adults. When it comes to infection, I'm not, and I believe that Dr. Agrawal expressed the same sort of opinion. There, the differential is much less, I think. And in fact,
but I appreciate that that may be your view, but so do you feel that to the extent that Dr. Agrawal does not have expertise in pediatric hemato-oncology, which I've discussed with him, that this issue doesn't arise for the purposes of this? It's not a problem.
It didn't concern me at all.
Right. Okay.
No.
Obviously, Dr. Drumright then becomes involved.
Yes, so we began to look at this, and I'd obviously read through the CNR and read through some of the other water reports.
So which are the water reports?
There was a small bundle of documents that were provided with the CNR when the two of us got those, and I felt, as did Dr. Agrawal, that maybe we needed to take the approach we could take would be look in a more broad sense, to look at time spans, and possibly look at different patient populations, but still obviously compromised patients with hematology, oncology problems. And then, and that would involve a lot of statistics. And although I understand statistics, I am not a statistician. And he mentioned that he'd worked with a very good statistician who'd met in Cambridge, I think, subsequently, Dr. Drumright. That's how we became involved with Dr. Drumright. She kindly agreed to help us with statistical support. And she was an ideal person because she spent 6 years working, I believe it was 6 years, at Imperial College with the infection control team there, working with infection control doctors and nurses in Imperial, applying epidemiological methods to infection control. So she's not just a statistician, she's someone who understands and has been immersed in infection control.
Now, what I thought it'd be helpful to do would be to look at the appendix to your letter of instruction, because it is phrased in the form of 7 questions. So to page 242. What I might do to assist you is to ask my colleague to zoom into the top half of the page. Questions 1 to 4 is visible, but nothing below that. Now, if this letter, I'm sure it is complete and correct, it was issued to you in November 22.
Yes.
So to what extent did your ideas on how you would look at this matter develop after these questions were set?
They did, because some of those questions are relatively easy to answer. Other ones, particularly when talking more specifically about the GGC setup, much more difficult to understand how one was going to approach that. And that's when we thought, well, we need to, if there was a problem, we would expect to see an increased rate of particular types of organisms, perhaps. But we needed to look at that data in more detail.
So if we go to the bottom half of the page, please, in question 5. So one of the questions appears to be 5B. Is there an increased level of infections consistent with there being widespread contamination in the water system, evidenced by an increased level of infections from these marker organisms? So could it be that this idea of looking at data was already inherent at the beginning?
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Okay.
And we just expanded its extent.
Sorry, Michael, Professor.
Yes, sorry.
You've said that you're thinking, having been presented with a list of questions, some more difficult than others, your thinking developed. Did the questions develop, or have the questions always been as they appear on this screen?
I think they were always as on that screen, essentially, and we've treated it, I suppose, rather more as a scientific exercise. So
you've looked at different methods of answering the same question?
Exactly.
Right, okay. Now, what I want to do is go back to the top of the screen, and I want to look at question 3 in some detail, because it's a topic that keeps coming around. So the first thing is obviously, I'm going to pass over question 1 because one appears to be the answer is no.
Yeah.
But if we look at question 2, what constitutes a contaminated hospital water system, particularly in reference to existing legislation and guidance? And question 3, if there was, quote, widespread contamination of the hospital water system, whether this was due to ingress contamination, regressional contamination, or contamination at installation and or commissioning, there are then 2 questions. What would be evident through water testing, and what would be the expected findings? Now, what I want to do in a moment is have a conversation with you about what you understand by the concept of widespread contamination. Before I do that, I'd like to look at the footnote. So if you go to the bottom of the page, footnote 1 is a reference to a document called the HPS Report, Summary of Incident and Findings at the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, Royal Hospital for Children, Water Contamination Incident, and Recommendations for NHS Scotland. Now, firstly, did you read this?
No.
Why not?
Well, I did glance at it, but I felt I wanted to approach this problem independently. This is obviously it's an investigation, and they've looked looked at things, but I felt we wanted to look at this independently.
So you've just told us a fact that's not in your report, that you were originally approached by someone from the health board who explained there'd been a series of reports.
Yes.
This is presumably one of that series of reports.
Well, it wasn't actually the health board person about the reports. It was CLO.
Oh, right. Well, if we look at this, well, let's ask you the question first, and then we'll look at the document. So we go back to the top of the page. What do you understand the person who was asking you the question meant by, quote, widespread contamination in question 2? Question 3, sorry.
Question 3. Well, it's not a simple contamination in a water system. I'm not a water engineer or an expert in water systems. I'm a microbiologist. However, the water system can become. There are two aspects of contamination. First of all, there's the legalistic aspect of contamination from a point of view of drinking water standards. Okay.
Well, yes.
Coliforms, counts of Enterobacter, Enterococci, etc. So that's that. But then you have the issue of other organisms, which certainly if we go back to the late teens, 2017, 18, 19, were not yet sort of, if you like, very widely recognised. They've known that they could be transmitted from water, but their role and position in a hospital water system was under research and development. In fact, that is still going on at the moment to try and understand. Because you can have a biofilm with Pseudomonas, maybe a few Stenotrophomonas in a water tank, supplying a whole load of cold water supplies in a hospital. In my understanding and my opinion, yes, that can be a source. And that's when we talk about ingress contamination. Because you have to ask yourself, where have these organisms come from? The only place they can come from is down the public water supply. And if you look at what occurs in the public water supply, you do not see Enterobacter. You certainly don't see E. coli because it wouldn't be potable quality water. So there's
When you say you would not see it,
it's just not there.
It's just not there at all.
No, generally. No.
So can I look at question 3? Because I did ask you a question which you've not yet answered, and we'll come back to it, which is what you understand by widespread contamination means. But look at question 3. The way it's phrased is, if there was, quote, widespread contamination of the hospital water system, whether this was due to ingress contamination, regressional contamination, or contamination at installation and or commissioning, which one of those possible scenarios you're being asked about is the one where it comes in from the public water system?
Ingressional.
Right. So could you, if we accept for the moment that contamination is the right word, presumably regressional contamination would be a means by which that a water system could acquire these organisms other than from the public water system?
Yes.
Yes. And similarly, at installation, you might get contamination.
Indeed, installation. And that rose out of incidents in Northern Ireland, in a special care baby unit, And I used to be founding member of the English RHI, responsible for infection control. And we had a lot of sessions at the time and tried to produce guidance on how one might look at, in this case, Pseudomonas particularly, and the relationship to what are known as thermostatic mixer valves, which nowadays they've changed the design of them, but then at that point they had types of plastic and rubber in them which enabled organisms like particularly Pseudomonas, but to a certain extent perhaps Stenotroph, other organisms, to grow on this valve and then of course contaminate the water. And this is a widespread problem in all healthcare facilities.
And this is the Horn Optitherm tap.
Yes, that's a particular make. I'm not particularly familiar with that make, but there are lots of different makes. Yeah.
So returning to the question, this question, I mean, firstly, I want to check I'm not being foolish. Is this question asking you to assess how the existence of widespread contamination would be evident? In essence, that's what it's trying to do.
It is.
Yes. So what do you understand is being meant by the person who asks you this question as, quote, widespread contamination?
Well, we, right or wrongly, we chose to look at the rate of infections that occur, because you will always find biofilm in taps, okay, in any ward. Does it become significant? Well, it may become significant because of the operational way in which that ward operates and that water system is used at a ward level.
So the reason I ask this is because of the footnote of the document you've only skim read. Let's look at it. Bundle 18, Volume 1, Document 11, which starts on page 819. And I want to look at the executive summary on page 820. 821, there we are. Now, this document describes what the authors seem to think of is a water contamination incident.
Yes, it is.
It is a water contamination incident.
Yes, it relates. This is one of the reasons why I thought clinically, how relevant is this? Because it focuses very much on Cuprovidus. Cuprovidus is a gram-negative organism. It's a true environmental organism in the sense that it is particularly water-orientated, and you can find it in any public water supply, sometimes in quite large numbers.
So you feel this report is just about Cuprovidus?
It feels like it's about.
Right, okay, but let's go to page 825 and the summary of clinical incidents. So were you aware that in 2016 of February, there was a Cuprovidus incident in Ward 2A?
Yeah.
And that's known as the aseptic pharmacy incident. Are you aware about that?
Yes.
Right.
I am now particularly, obviously.
When did you become aware of that?
I suppose really once it was clear that our report was going to be considered by the inquiry.
So before you wrote the report, you were unaware of the 2016 aseptic pharmacy?
I'd seen Cuprovidus, very small numbers, and the relationship to the vast majority of infections on the ward didn't seem to me to be particularly necessarily relevant.
Are you aware that the opinion of the people who investigated it was a localized outbreak related to one sink?
No, but that's interesting that they found that. Yeah.
Then, if we look at the second half of that paragraph, a mention of a September 17 further single case.
Yeah.
And then 2018 January, another case.
Yeah.
And do you see that there's then reference to Pseudomonas in line 4 from February, and then Stenotrophomonas in March, 3 cases.
Yeah.
And then Enterobacter.
Yes.
3 mixed gram-negative bacilli. So there's not a paper about just Cuprovidus, is it?
No. But I was aware, having read the CNR, that the CNR was very comprehensively looked at all of these organisms and collated those bloodstream infections in relation to that.
So the problem that I'm trying to sort of press you on is about how to use your opinions.
Okay.
So if we go back to the term of reference, the appendix, page 242 of bundle 44, volume 1, that we were looking at before, and the top of the page. The health board have asked you a question, and the question appears, question 3, to be defined by reference to a concept of widespread contamination. And this concept of widespread contamination remains in dispute in this inquiry.
Okay.
And there have been a significant number of witnesses who think the word is entirely appropriate. There have been a small number of witnesses who think the word is not technically accurate because contamination is more about non-biological material in a water system.
Okay.
And there have been a small number of witnesses who take the view that there was not widespread contamination in the water system, from their opinion. There are also reports at the time of people who have this opinion. So you didn't read the document you were given by those instructing you that sets out the nature of this scenario, did you? No. You've written a report, you've come to some conclusions, and you've evolved those conclusions as we've shown you more material.
Yeah.
To some degree. This is the question. What utility is your original report, given that it was written without being aware of the details of this hypothesis that is set in this instruction?
What we did have access to was a very comprehensive data report and also results of a lot of water testing about widespread contamination, the so-called Chapel data.
So the Chaput report?
Yeah.
Oh, you had that?
Yes, and in fact, that was very helpful because it gave it actually gave actual data on what their testing results were and the pattern of testing and the sort of organisms they were encountering. So there are organisms in the water system. I would say anyone who says there are there's no contamination, yes, there is contamination. The key for me is, and if you went into many hospitals, you would find a not dissimilar finding, I think. And that's ingressional contamination, often with Pseudomonas, sometimes with other organisms. It's what measures you take to control it and how you recognise that and what impact that has on the patient population.
So one of the problems, I suppose, is that you had the CNR overview report.
Yes.
And you read that.
Yes, oh, absolutely.
Yes. And I don't think there's any dispute that it contains a lot of information.
Yeah.
And that is often chronologically ordered, so you can tell where all the things are. Very helpful. But it only covers the period up to when it's finished.
Yes.
You then have Dr. Chaput's report.
Yes.
Which tells you when water testing was done by month.
Yeah.
And the result. Got that?
Yeah.
I wondered the effect. What's the effect of you not having access to certain other material? So do you remember how in the first questionnaire, it's that volume 2, page 24, I asked you a series of questions about documents that we've been looking at. And so I think it would be fair to say that this inquiry has spent a large amount of time and called a large number of witnesses to discuss these documents, including the authors of most of them, people present at almost every meeting. And to take two examples, the first one on 10A, the DMA Canyon 2015 L8 risk assessment, and the minutes of the Water Technical Group meetings on 13th of April 18 and 20th of April 18, you didn't feel they were in the scope of your remit?
No, because what I would have to do then is one would have to go back and try and, if you like, reconstruct from these documents and minutes what actually happened in terms of infection control and infection management in the board as such. And I'm looking at it as a third party who's never visited the hospital.
Sorry, what did you say about visiting the hospital?
I've never visited it.
You've never visited them?
Not to look at water systems or anything. I've given 2 expert lectures on gram-negative bacteria there, but that was purely to the microbiology department.
But you haven't familiarised yourself with the water system or the ventilation system?
No, not particularly on the ventilation. Well, neither of those, because that wasn't what we were led by CLO to do. They didn't say, come up and look at all the systems. And I wouldn't feel necessarily qualified. Dr. Walker, who I've worked with before, I believe, has given evidence to you as an inquiry. He's an expert on water systems. I published a paper with him. He would give you a much better opinion on the state and running of those systems.
So this is the problem that I'm going to float. And I will invite you to come back to this if you reflect on it over the rest of the day and you think there's a better way of expressing your answer. I'm very keen to hear it. I understand that one can do a dispassionate, agnostic, I think might be Dr. Agarwal's word,
Indeed.
data analysis exercise and produce a chart or four showing the rates of infections of certain microorganism groups in certain patient groups over periods of time. And if you park for a moment the fact that sometimes it's quite hard to define the patient groups and the spaces if you don't know the hospital, if you just sort of brush over that issue, you can produce possibly informative charts.
Yes.
But what I worry about, and what I'm keen to understand your response to, is the suggestion that you then follow up that with interpretation. So within this report, there are various points when you interpret, the three of you, charts. Now, what value can the inquiry take from interpretation of a chart or a statistical exercise carried out by clearly experts who don't know what was happening at the time and don't have the context in the field of epidemiology? Well,
I think when you start talking about the field of epidemiology, that's something where Dr. Drumright is the expert in understanding that. She managed that aspect of our work.
Okay, but you don't feel that, for example, when you discuss what you said for a moment ago that you thought the principal issue, the only way you could get Pseudomonas into a water system, I think it was Pseudomonas, was in the ingressional receptor.
You can ingressional, but also I didn't say it's the only way, because regressional contamination of taps is very common.
Right. In order to know whether there was regressional contamination of taps, would you need to know the type of tap and the way the ward, in the broadest sense, was being run in basic infection control terms?
No, because you look at the microbiology.
And so you feel that you can interpret the microbiology without an awareness of what was going on in the ward at the time?
We're interpreting it at a fairly high level here, because, as I say, we use the concept that if there is a problem, we would expect to see an increase in the rate of infections. Now, whether that
when you use the word problem, what do you have in mind?
It's a hypothesis. We look to see if there is an increase. It's perhaps a more accurate way of putting it. And as it happened, we did see an increase at one period. And now other people have found that in other analytical studies. Mr. Mukherjee's work showed there was an increase, and that was an important and interesting finding.
What I want to do is I'll come back to Dr. Chaput's report later.
Right.
Because I think you address it in the conclusions, and we're still in sort of early stages. So what I want to do is look at chapter 5, and if we could go to chapter 5, which starts on page 41, or page 51 of the bundle. No, the wrong bundle, sorry, 44, volume 1. We'll go back a bit. 45, please. There we are. Now, you discuss in 5.2 what constitutes a contaminated hospital water system. Would it help if we zoom that into half the page?
Yeah, that would be
Please, could we
helpful.
do that?
Thank you. Yes.
But I might ask my colleague to generally jump to the top half of a page from now on, and if necessary, we'll move around. If we move down the page, so 5.2 is at the top of the screen. Now, you make reference to Public Water Supply Scotland Regulations 2014 in the context of the potable water standards.
Yeah.
Now, I think the next few questions are going to sound quite pedantic, but I've been asked to ask them. Why do you refer to potable rather than wholesome, which is the language used in the regulations?
Oh, sorry. That's a term I'm used to as an environmental microbiologist in England.
The next thing is, why does this chapter not make any reference to the sort of industry standard regulatory documents about managing water systems in hospitals?
Because I'm not a water engineer, I'm not really qualified to make comments on the design and construction and use of water systems.
Well, the reason I mention that is because I may have misunderstood, but I get the impression from some of our witnesses who are water engineers and water system operators that water systems are managed to avoid risk, as opposed to by doing lots of testing to check you haven't got a problem. Would you agree with that as a broad?
Yes, no, absolutely.
Sorry, Professor, my apologies. That's not quite how I understand things.
I'm standing corrected.
I'm wrong about that. I want to be corrected. The way you phrased the question was that they were to avoid risk. Now, my understanding, and I want to be corrected if I'm wrong, is that by their nature, for example, hospital water system presents risk.
Yes, well,
but those responsible for managing the system are involved in managing a given and inevitable risk. Now, have I got that wrong?
I think you have, Lord. I think I've misspoken. So it's that there is an inevitable risk which you then manage.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Now, the reason I mention that is because a response to the question, what constitutes a contaminated water system, might well be, well, normally we don't talk about contaminated water systems. We talk about the extent to which risks within the water system are not managed. And I just wonder why you didn't make that connection to the management of water systems in this case.
Because I'm a microbiologist and infectious disease physician.
So the fact that there are hospital technical memorandum covering design, operation, testing protocols, written schemes, control of Legionella, it's not your field, effectively.
Not my field. I'm aware of them, and as a practical level, I'm working with my engineering colleagues in hospitals I've worked in the past, but they lead on that area.
So there is an area where there might be a crossover, and I'd be grateful for your assistance. So our first ex-witness in this inquiry in Block 3, so that was last year, was a Mr. Watson, who'd been the head of the DMA Canyon team. And he talked about his work in the hospital from 2015, trying to manage the hospital water system.
Right.
And I seem to remember that he accepted that, or even felt that if you have a water system that is where risks of Legionella growth are not well managed because of temperature, it seems a reasonable concern that such a temperature environment might also encourage, and I emphasize might also encourage other microorganisms other than the regulated ones to grow. I wonder if that's, from your point of view as a microbiologist, a reasonable...
Very reasonable. In fact, Legionella can't survive without other organisms around it. It's incapable of independent existence. It needs a functioning biofilm, and often we now reckon, I believe, scientifically, from a microbiological point of view, there are some specific organisms which Legionella needs to survive.
Yes, and are you agreeing with the proposition that was put to you that what is true for Legionella may be true for other potentially pathogenic organisms.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
What I wanted to do was to look at this section, and actually, I'm going to make sure I've got the right page in front of me before I put it on the screen. It's actually on page 48. If we go to the middle of the text, let's stay on the whole page first, just so we can get context here, Professor.
Yes.
So this is the end of section 5.2.
Okay.
Section 5.3 begins below it, but I'm going to ask to zoom into the middle of the screen. Do you see the line that goes, using highly discriminatory whole genome sequencing?
Yes.
I'm going to ask my colleague to put that at the top and to widen out as far as we can go. So we move up. Now, it's the last sentence I want to explore with you. Now, I appreciate that I'm selectively quoting from a chapter and that you have probably drawn this summary from the whole chapter.
Yeah.
But the sentence reads, in summary, although sink traps have a diverse and sometimes profuse bacterial population, which is enriched sometimes by human-derived materials, and consequently bacteria associated with human colonization or infection, they are not the dominant source of bloodstream infections when compared to gut or oral microbiomes of immune-compromised patients themselves. Now, the thing I'm going to ask you about is the think traps bit of that sentence.
Yes.
Now, because you'll see that Couchard is using whole genome sequencing to assess the role of sink traps, if I've understood correctly.
And that was because they had no Pseudomonas in their water supply at all, in their taps.
So they looked in the sink traps.
Yes.
But what I'm trying to understand is the extent to which, well, what is your mental image of this widespread contamination that you are being asked to assess whether it exists? Because firstly, let's break that down so I can make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth. Would it be fair to describe that much of this report is an attempt to say, if there was widespread contamination, would we see it in the water testing results or the bloodstream infection results? It's broadly speaking what the exercise is. Yes. No?
Yes. I have to say, I mean, because a lot of the sampling was very ad hoc and not structured like a prospective research study.
Yes.
And I think that weakens its value to a degree. It gives you an indication as the sort of organisms present, but it's difficult to be very conclusive in that setting. And I think other experts have said that previously, and I would agree with them.
The reason I ask that is because...
Sorry, it's entirely my fault, Professor.
No, don't worry.
Just for my notes. You referred to the ad hoc nature of the sampling. I just didn't catch what you went on to say.
Oh, what did I say? Ad hoc. Yes, so it wasn't structured. The papers I've referred to here, because we have a problem in real life and real outbreaks, we don't have the facilities or the manpower necessarily to always investigate them in a great detail. So in practice, one looks at the literature and other people who've done careful prospective studies with time and resources to look in great detail at these sorts of environments, be they tap outlets or sink traps, and trying to correlate that perhaps with infection in vulnerable patients to draw some broad conclusions as to what one might see in practice, in real life. And that's one of the difficulties of investigating outbreaks.
Now, I just wonder whether there would be any difference in the approach one would take to investigate an outbreak that you suspected was built around an individual sink or an individual ward compared to a suspected outbreak for which there is a hypothesis that it involves the entire hospital water system. would they require different investigatory techniques to understand?
I wouldn't sort of different investigatory techniques. It's an issue of manpower and facilities and degree. And there they would have to make an assessment as to whether the clinical impact, the level at which you're going to go within that investigation.
But from your point of view, coming in retrospectively, looking at data, do you need to know whether it's a hypothetical single ward, room, or sink outbreak that's being floated as a possibility, or a hypothetical whole hospital system issue that's being? Do you need to know that it's one or the other in order to design your study?
Which study are we talking about?
The HAD report.
Okay, no, because it's been very difficult to do that because it's a big, complicated hospital. You've got lots of individual sinks, you've got lots of individual risk factors, you've got lots of individual different patients. We felt, rightly or wrongly, that it would be difficult to try and dissect out and tease all those details. And we'd have to do it because we're quite a long way down the tracks in time terms by going back and looking at people's records and notes, which may or may not be consistent or appropriate. So that's our whole philosophy, was to say, well, let's step back here. Let's see whether there was a problem, what that problem might be, if we saw it in terms of bloodstream infections with organisms that are likely to come from the environment. And that was the thrust of our investigation. Really.
But I just wondered whether, when it comes to the topic, which I hope to deal with after the coffee break, of whole genome sequencing, it would be a fair criticism to suggest that you might, to some extent, have in your mind's eye a smaller outbreak than actually it is being suggested by some people took place.
The organisms that we're talking about, ingress contamination here, and to a certain extent the retrogressive tap colonisation. In the vast majority of the hospital, it doesn't matter at all. It's only in areas like intensive care units, burns units, and immunocompromised patients, the hematology oncology patients, that becomes a factor. So that's a consideration. And the other consideration is that if we look at the hematology oncology patients, the vast majority of their infections, and this the CNR actually, supports, it's just the degree to which they support. 70% of patients they thought were not most probably infected from the environment, 30%. So where did they get those? Where did the 70% get their infections from? They got them from their gut. Okay, translocation of the bacteria from the gut into the bloodstream causing infection. So that's one common route. Now, you immediately say, well, okay, how did the gut get colonized? It could have got colonized in some patients' cases from a tap that has a Pseudomonas in it, but it also could get contaminated from all sorts of other areas. And there's another means of transmission, which is very common in hospitals, which we call person to person. And that may be directly by contact with people to people, by handshake or touch on the skin. Klebsiella is particularly good at doing this. So that's one possibility. But then there's also the staff in terms of hand cleaning and management. And here with hematology oncology patients, I know you've heard already, they're very prone to line infections. They have to have long-term indwelling intravascular lines. Those entry sites, not only
Professor, we've heard a lot about,
but you know all about that.
Can I take a step back? And if I've just got this wrong, please tell me, Professor. Mr. McIntosh has been asking you, if I've understood his questioning correctly, questions about methodology, approach, technique, in particular in relation to the what we're calling the HAD report, the report by you and your colleagues. Now, listening to your answers, it appears to me that you are telling us that this report is not directed at any particular hypothesis. Now, if I've got that wrong, just tell me.
No, I think that's a very fair comment, yes.
Right.
We wanted to approach in an unbiased way.
Right. Maybe that this sort of will save us time. The questions framed by, as I understand it, framed by the CLA, series of questions under 7 general headings, do appear to me to present, in fact, a series of, as it were, sub-hypotheses. Now, I think I'm generalizing at this point. In my reading of the HAD report, I don't see certainly all of these sub-hypotheses addressed. Now, that would seem to me consistent with what you've previously told me, that it would be fair in looking at the HAD report to bear in mind that you are not addressing any particular hypothesis.
Yes, I think that would be a fair comment.
Thank you.
I wonder if we can go to the next page, page 49, and the first paragraph, section of 5.3.2, in which you ask the question, if so, what would be the expected findings that would demonstrate there has been a widespread contamination? And you say here, it has hopefully become clear from the explanation above, when a water system is a source of environmental contamination, and when it is spread to vulnerable patients, it's generally not the whole system, which has a high bacterial load. It's rather specific outlets, such as tap outlets and sink traps, which can be heavily colonized and therefore represent a potential source of spread for patients. Now, I want to show you a document, which I know you didn't see at the time, but was on your document list. So we can take that off the screen and go to bundle 10, the minutes of the water technical group. And if we can go, please, to document 2, page 9. So you may have read this when we put it on document list. This is a minute of a meeting that was set up just at the start of the water incident. And at this point, it's chaired by an assistant director for Health Facilities Scotland. Membership consists of a nurse consultant for Health Facilities Scotland, the principal engineer of that organisation, a number of senior managers, a consultant in public health medicine, and another infection control doctor is on the apologies list, along with about Miss Kane, who at that point was the co-chair of the water safety group for the whole health board. Now, if we move down to the matters arising, you will see the minutes describe, stop there please, the outcome of the water testing is currently being mapped onto the floor plans of RHC and adult hospital. Those present will show samples of the work conducted at the time. The spreadsheet and drawings used together show the rooms, risers that have returned positive results and what these are. Discussions continued as the next step. It was suggested that the risers be next to be subject to testing and then on to the heat exchangers. The question of the rooms that are shown on the floor plans with no indication of the issue of the water, does this reflect they are not affected? This means they're not being tested. They're not being tested. Tested being carried out on advice of infection control. AR, who's from HPS, noted that it would be beneficial to have some spot tests carried at other areas. Now, if we go over to the next page to agreed, and stop there, please. Second paragraph of the bullets. The group asked where has already been tested. It was confirmed that not all taps and showers tested, but there's been random tests carried out from all areas of the hospital. These are noted as 0, 1 to 3, that's levels 1 to 3 in the children's hospital, levels 4 to 11, that's in the tower in the main hospital. It was noted that every floor had positive and negative readings, thereby this would indicate a widespread water infection. If we go to the next minute of the next meeting, this is April the 20th of 2018, and which is on page 14. And we go to the heading. At this point, membership it's broadly the same, but now the leading infection control doctor, Dr. Inkster, has joined via telephone, having not been present at the previous meeting. Go to the heading, way forward, bottom of the page. Every floor is showing some contamination with various species, so we can assume there is widespread contamination in the buildings. A review of the commissioning data indicates there was TVC which were off the scale, but we now need to determine the way forward and solution to the contamination. Now, I accept that's a snapshot from 2 meetings, relatively senior people, and these people don't, well, some of them don't know about the existence of the DMA Canyon reports at this point.
Right.
And that may be important. But what I wonder is if we go back to page 49 of volume 44, volume 1, and your discussion of what it's generally not the whole system which has a high bacterial load. Could it be that one does need to think about a whole system as a high bacterial in order to analyze the data and understand it, which you've produced?
Well, it depends upon what we mean by whole system contamination. I notice, if you go back, I'm not certain
Page 14.
whether they were testing, did they test water storage tanks?
I think at that point they might have done, but
Because
yes, they did. So if we go back to page
okay,
14 of bundle 10, the bit I read out was heading of way forward. If we go up, matters arising. IP provided several drawings of the site showing locations of water into the site, the floor levels affected by bacteria. It was noted that the spreadsheet results had shown there was now contamination in the tanks. 2 tests are required as
these have always been reported as clear.
Sorry.
Exception 1 report. Okay.
Sorry, my fault.
Yes,
Which
sorry.
bit are you reading from?
I was just reading from the middle paragraph.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just sort of trying to absorb that. Noted. Now, okay. When
And
they
then if we
say
go to Dr. Taput's work, which of course you have seen, which is bundle 18, volume 1, document 2, and I just thought, because since you mentioned cupriovirus, we'll go to page 35. The reason I put this on the screen is just to show that I think, as you've already observed, there wasn't a lot of testing going on before. You go right to the bottom of the page, please. Before the start of 2018, and then there's a lot of testing.
Yeah.
So the question I'm asking is it a reasonable criticism of your approach to this topic that you worked on the basis that generally it's not a whole system issue?
Yes, generally, but there's data here to suggest that perhaps at that particular point, because tanks have been sampled, there was a tank problem.
But I'm just wondering whether, if we go through, we're going to turn in 45 minutes or so to the topic of what you learned from genome sequencing. We've obviously got to understand what you're saying and work out how it helps answer the question.
Yeah.
And I think this is why I leave methodology. If the question is, what would you see in the context of widespread contamination, if there was widespread contamination, am I making a fair criticism that you seem to have approached your paper on the assumption that whatever issue there was, it wasn't a whole system issue?
Yes.
Right.
Right. Again, can I just also got that? Right, and the fact that, so what I understand you're accepting, Professor, is that if we look at the HAD report, the approach is to assume that when one is considering environmental sources for gram-negative infections, point 1, usual experience reported in the literature is single location. And it is on the assumption that that is what you're considering that the report proceeds on. Have I got that right?
Yes, but that's what I mean by single location. It can be a single tap. It also can be an entire wall, in which sinks or outlets can become contaminated.
Right.
What we do understand is that very often when the biofilm builds up, particularly in the fraps, there's been more work done perhaps on traps than actually on outlets from taps, you will see individual strains of you don't tend to see a great diversity of organisms. You'll see one or two strains, shall we say, of Pseudomonas, and they'll be different, maybe in a different tap on the same ward. So it's a very complex situation.
But you're accepting from Mr. McIntosh that your report was to proceed on the basis that if one was considering environmental sources, it is either a single tap or perhaps a single location as large as a ward.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And are you also accepting the proposition he put to you that that might be said to be a criticism of that approach?
Indeed. But it is interesting that the one organism that appears here as ingress contaminant is the very organism which is very common in tap water. So I can see a reasonable reason why that might be if the tank management didn't clean it out properly, because it's cuprovidous.
Well, indeed, I put it on the screen. I'll take that off the screen and ask you a sort of general question before leaving methodology behind. I wonder if this sentence, this concept, has any flaws in it. Could it be that the sort of environmental gram-negative bacteria that you study could, in a particular patient population, have multiple different sources? If you look across, some will be brought in by the patients, some will be patient to patient, some will come in from the water system, some will be regressional contamination, and we can come up with more esoteric ideas. But there are lots of different possibilities, and they can all be happening at once.
Exactly.
So what I want to do is look at your definition, which I think is a little bit harsh a way of phrasing it, but to keep it short, of the sort of organisms you're interested in. So this is on page 50 of volume 1 of bundle 44. Now, we can obviously read the whole of chapter 5, but am I right to think, if you look at the bottom of page 50 from 5.4, on which organisms, am I right in thinking that in essence, what you've done is you've looked at all the organisms and you've come up with a list, which you call various things, but environmentally relevant is the sort of most common phrase. And that's your work.
Yes, but it's taken not only from a lot of experience, but also the published literature and a knowledge of the epidemiology and the way in which these bacteria behave. Because there's a blend between the ability of an organism to cause disease in a human. So there are some organisms which you can find in hospital sinks, in water tanks, that even in a compromised patient, you are either never or very, very, very unlikely to ever see an infection. And then there are other gram-negative bacteria, have a different epidemiology, which can cause infection in those highly compromised patients. And then there are other gram-negatives that can cause infection in relatively non-compromised patients.
The reason I ask is because other people have attempted to come up with these lists. Now, I don't see any particular value in asking you about attempts that were done after your work was done. I mean, it doesn't seem much point in that. But we know that HPS attempted various categorizations. And I wanted to see whether you had looked at this particular document, which is listed in your documents you refer to in the report.
Yeah.
And that is the HPS review of the NHS GGC infection outbreaks in pediatric hemato-oncology, October 2019. So that's bundle 7, document 6, page 214. I would look at the whole page for this one, page 214. No, not that one. Bundle 7, document 6, please. Bundle 7, not volume 7. Perfect. Now, this is listed in your document list.
Yes.
And I can ask whether you read it.
I've read the microbiological aspects of it, yes.
Well, that you may be able to help me. Go to page 219.
There is a definition, isn't there, of organisms there?
What, a series of definitions. Now,
Yes,
I appreciate
there we
it's
go.
short. Now, what I wanted just to do is I think we know, we've been told a lot by lots of people what gram-negative, gram-positive might mean. But there's been quite a lot of people who've given this piece of evidence of opinion, that if you take the environmental bacterial group identified by HPS in this paper, and you add to it, down at the bottom of the page, you add to it 5 enteric organisms to create the environmental including enteric group, that it is that group, this sort of combined group, that in very broad terms is broadly similar to your environmentally relevant group that you've operated in.
Yes.
It's not quite the same, but it's
not quite the same. There are some detail I won't question. Rosemonas, for instance, is only found as a mouth colonizer of humans, not an environmental organism. But that's a minor point, broadly, yes. And again, to separate them out is interesting, and you might want to do that. But, for instance, Klebsiella pneumoniae, which is a species that causes infections,
yes,
that is quite capable of free-living existence on plants, the same sort of strains. So is that an enteric group? Well, yes, it can turn up and colonize the human gut. But it is, if you like, it's quite capable of sitting in the environmental group. So I personally would prefer to put these almost all together.
Yes. So this combined group, which is eventually is what HPS reviewed, of the second and third bullet points together, they've called the environmental including enteric group. And you're saying that, broadly speaking, it's roughly the same as your group.
Yeah.
Now, ignoring the epidemiological problems in doing this, which Dr. Drumright and others have described at length, pushing them to one side, does that mean there's a point of comparison, epidemiologically nervousness aside, between work done by HPS on the environmental including enteric group and your work with Dr. Drumright? Can you sort of see a possibility of reading across? Right, well, that's very helpful.
Roughly reading across,
roughly. What I wanted to do is just discuss at this point the concept of what we've been told are called polymicrobial cases. So because I'm worried I always get the words definitions wrong, I'm going to explain what I understand and you can tell me whether I got it wrong. The way it's been put to us in evidence is that you might have a patient who gives a blood sample, and within that blood sample, 2, 3, or maybe 4 different microorganisms would be grown. And it's been suggested that this is relatively unusual and somewhat concerning. And what I want to check is whether I've got a broadly sensible definition of a polymicrobial case.
I mean, 4 organisms would be highly unusual in my experience, but possible. 2, yes, 3. And there are two conclusions, which I assess it as a clinician in that setting. Is this contamination? Because when the blood culture is taken, we not infrequently see contamination of the sample. So that's one possibility to exclude when you're evaluating the clinical value of polymicrobial bacteremia. My next thought would be, has this patient got a long line in? Because one of the things with long lines is they also develop biofilm inside the body, inside the bloodstream. And repeated injections, which is why we've got those long lines in, may result in environmental or even non-environmental, if you like, E. coli, and particularly gram-positive bacteria such as Staphylococcus aureus get into that line, they sit on the biofilm and they sit there and they will give you a positive blood culture and potentially cause problems for the patient in terms of infection. So that's my concept of polymicrobial bacteremia.
So I'm just wondering...
You've used the expression long line. Am I right in thinking that's simply another way of describing a central line?
Yes, central line, yes.
What I wanted to ask you about that is, it's been suggested by us that in fact you just said that the number of these things might be a subject of concern.
Yes.
Individual patient. And I'm wondering, and there's been some evidence that, and I'm trying to get the reference here, that I think it's in Ms. Harvey Wood and Dr. Peters' paper from October 18. I wonder if you saw this. This is Bundle 19, Volume 1, page 143. If you didn't see it, I won't take you through it. Have you seen this before?
No, I've not read it.
We'll take that off the screen.
Yeah.
What I'm just suggesting to you is that if it was the case that there was an increase in polymicrobial bloodstream cultures in a certain point in the events in this hospital, would that be something that the infection control team would be interested in as a source of concern?
Well, in patients with lines in,
Yes.
okay, any bacteremia is of concern. Something we always review and should be reviewed. And they would fall probably into that category because a lot of these patients, I would imagine, would have central lines, long lines in.
What I wondered was the extent to which your data analysis of bloodstream infections, which you designed with Dr. Drumwright and Dr. Agrawal, can pick up any growth in polymicrobial cases.
As far as I'm aware, we didn't have a specific category for polymicrobial. We did see, when I have looked at the data, they did see occasional polymicrobial results. And again, in highly compromised patients, that's not unusual. It doesn't have to necessarily be from the environment. If they have a really suppressed immune system, then, and Dr. Agrawal may have touched on this, I can't remember, then you will see more than one organism invade through the gut wall and get into the bloodstream and cause an infection. That can occur.
Now, thinking about the sort of concept of this study, I think it's not necessary to go to the source, but I get the strong impression that the argument presented, which I think might be the executive summary, but is that you would see the greatest impact of, in fact, we'll take it from page 61, please, of Bundle 44, Volume 1. In fact, we'll take it from the executive summary, we'll take it from page 6. Paragraph 2, so we can zoom in to the top half of the page. And you say that the greatest impact would be in severely immunocompromised patients. Hence, this report is targeted on patients with hematological and other cancers undergoing intensive chemotherapy and hematopoietic stem cell transplants. Now, your study looked at both adult and pediatric patients within that category.
Yes.
Have I read the paper correctly to understand that you're suggesting that we would have to see a signal in the data in both groups in order to suggest there was a problem?
No, because it depends where the groups were managed. If we're thinking environment, okay?
So you need to know they had access to water that was...
Not so much access to water, but the physical location. If there was a particular association with a location, one might expect to see a higher rate in that location if it had a problem. And in fact, in going to look at the adults, we were aware that we could just look at Ward 2AB, just the children's unit, but we've got no context or understanding of what the general rate and occurrence of infection is, which is why we agreed we would request data for other sites, particularly as there's quite a lot of patient movement, as you heard from previous witnesses, and also the length of time, rather than looking at a very, very narrow time.
Yes, so Dr. Agrawal explained, last week, time flies when they're doing this, that on Friday, that he explained the idea was you'd look at the rate, just looking at the pediatrics for a moment, in Ward 2A, in the Shannon, in those patients, and compare it with the experience of, as it were, their predecessors, with the same consultant team, same treatment team in the old unit in York Hill. And that's part of what you're describing.
Yes.
Yes. And I put to him the suggestion that you might be able to look forward as well, because if you knew there were interventions to the water system that the health board strongly argues, indeed there may be quite evidence to support this conclusion, has changed and improved the water in the water system, removed the microbial proliferation, then you actually did the study the same way, but now between before the intervention and after the intervention, effectively use the hospital as its own control. Now, did you do that?
I think we did, because we went as far as we could with the data we'd got, and we did in fact see, and Dr. Drumright has used very good statistics to demonstrate this, the general decline and then a rise. Okay.
But your original report didn't say that.
Well, it's because it's a piece of work in evolution.
Right.
And it was very helpful to be working.
Let's take this in steps, because I think Professor Hawkey may have not been given the opportunity to finish.
No, I think that's fair, my lord. I interrupted.
You were talking about the trend and general decline, then a rise. And my impression was that you were then interrupted.
Yeah, and then a fall. And that data was a result of further analysis subsequent to the report, our report being accepted post-March, April. And I think that has been very helpful, because it takes, if you like, it moves us beyond HAD itself.
Right, and there's something useful for me in that. So I think you used the expression that the HAD report was, as it were, work in progress, or right.
Yes.
Right, that's so. I think from that, you would not encourage us not just to look at the HAD report, but look at what has occurred as a result of the
dialogue, probably
interactions between the relevant professionals.
Absolutely.
Right. Thank you.
Now, at the risk of making progress, I'd like to look at a concept that you mentioned earlier in the report. So it's the same document, but it's page 20, and the bottom of the page, 2.2, what is meant by an outbreak.
Yes.
Now, in order to take this quickly, having shown you where the section is to assist your memory, I'm actually going to go back to the executive summary, because you summarize it, to ask you the question. So it's page 6 and paragraph 5 of the executive summary. If you want to go back to the main document, please do. But the reason I want to look at paragraph 5 is you ask, albeit in summarized form, what is an outbreak? In clinical practice, an outbreak is suspected. There's an increase beyond the normally expected numbers of infections due to a specific bacterium. Relatedness of those infections in time and space provides circumstantial evidence for cross-infection. A strict definition is the occurrence of 2 or more cases of infection caused by genetically indistinguishable microorganisms. Now, I've had a number of questions around this to ask, and I think they all boil down to this. No one really has any problem with everything apart from the last sentence.
Okay.
And I wonder how you respond to this sequence of questions. So, how would you respond to the suggestion that this strict definition is in fact an overly and impractical definition, given that you can't really realistically do whole genome sequencing?
In some outbreak infections, you can fulfill that strict criteria. And a number of outbreaks I've been involved with investigating using not just molecular typing, but older type of typing methods. You can do that. But that's why we have the earlier sentence, which says, and the CNR actually described it very nicely as well, saying, actually, we never found any that on our case notes review we could say were definite. However, we did find there were associations in other categories. And I think that's the best way of looking at it.
Because the point I need to put to you is the is Chapter 3 of the National Infection Prevention Control Manual. So if we go to this is not the latest version; it keeps being updated. But Volume 27, Volume 4,
Sorry, Bundle 47.
Bundle
27. Bundle 27.
Bundle 27, Volume 4, Document 16, page 178. Yes. I'm assuming you're familiar. We'll zoom in so that the top half of the page is across the whole screen. But and so that 3.1 definitions is the top of the screen. So now we've got section 3.1 of the National Infection Prevention Control Manual on the screen. Thank you. I'm assuming you're familiar with this document, given your job in Shetland.
Yes.
Would you accept that there's no discussion in the National Infection Prevention Control Manual of the need for organisms to be genetically indistinguishable for there to be an outbreak?
But you see, if you read a healthcare-associated infection outbreak, which is what we're talking about, 2 or more linked cases with the same infectious agent. And the key word there is same.
So you would see that as an example of a indistinguishable...
Yes, indistinguishable at the level of identification you've had. And without getting into too much detail, one of the problems encountered, for instance, with the investigation in Glasgow was the identification of Enterobacter.
Well, we're going to come to that.
You come to that, okay. But what I would say, the relevance is that if you apply the identification method which the lab was using, it looks like you've got more than one, the same organism causing infection on more than one occasion or on the same occasion. But actually, if you then use a better identification technique, you find they're not the same organism.
No, I understand that. I'm grateful for you making the connection between the two issues. But if we just stay at the sort of high level of the definition of outbreak, well, the definition of an incident, an outbreak, would you accept that there are 2 separate definitions there? And the second one doesn't refer to the need for genetic indistinguishability. It's or a higher than expected number of cases.
Yeah, and that's a much looser definition, which is helpful often in saying, yes, I think we might have a problem here. We need to do some more investigation. The first one is much more targeted and much, if you like, a sort of more of a red flag.
Can I suggest that if one was trying to understand what the manual means by the same infectious agent, it means what appears to be the same on the basis of the information that the clinicians have available to them at the time.
That's the practical reality. And as a microbiologist, I may see, oh gosh, we've got 3 cases of Pseudomonas on my ward in a relatively short time period. That's the point where we institute subtyping, bacterial strain typing, because it may be that all 3 of those Pseudomonas are entirely different, or they may be genetically, or not necessarily genetically. There are other typing techniques. The typing techniques which go beyond the species level say, actually, they're all identical. That is a very worrying situation and tends to suggest we've got some sort of source, some transmission infection going on. That's a very important concept, and it's a hard one to get, which is why, in a way, I wrote much of that earlier part of the chapter on naming bacteria and what level of discrimination we use.
My lord, this might be a good point. I haven't got quite as far as I wanted to, but I'm probably about 10 minutes behind. But I wonder if this would be a good time to take the morning coffee break.
Professor, as I indicated, we usually take a coffee break. Can I ask you to be back for 10 to 12?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you.
No problem at all.
I hope you'll be provided with a cup of coffee.
Yeah, that would be good.
Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, Rod. Professor, I wonder if we can just look back at the executive summary and use it as a hook to ask a couple of questions about normal levels of risk. So it's page 6 of volume 44, volume 1. Now, paragraph 3 seems entirely uncontroversial. That infection risk is multifactorial and varies depending on a microorganism's ability to cause disease, its natural habitat, its ability to spread, its accessibility of the host to infection. If an increased infection rate is observed, this is not necessarily attributable to the built environment, given this complexity. I don't think I'm aware of anyone who said otherwise.
No.
Could I ask just for
Yes, please.
my understanding, would you include dose in the sense of the amount of bacteria to which the patient is exposed? Is that a concept you would accept?
Yes, it can be, and even in relation to environment. So if you've got a sink trap that has a very heavy growth of a particular organism, and you've got a very vulnerable patient, then the probability or probability of that patient being exposed to enough organisms to get into their line or get into their GI tract is higher, I would suggest. Yeah.
Right. And I think part of my interest in that question is, does it follow that if you have an infection control mechanism which is aimed at dilution of potential bacterial concentration, that may have a beneficial effect?
Yes, and that's the principle of trying, for instance, to disinfect drains or to reduce the load, bacterial load. More often, one of the more effective ways sometimes is to interrupt the route of transmission. And that's a very important concept. Yeah, to prevent those patient meeting those organisms in a vulnerable way.
Thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. McIntosh.
So I wanted to look at the references to normal in the next two sentences and try and explore whether they are what they mean. I have a suspicion that some people might conflate the two, and that may be good, it may be bad. And so you say in 4, to assess if there is an increased risk of infection, a normal level of risk must be established. Now, what do you mean by a normal level of risk?
Well, this is really applying to the very vulnerable hematology oncology type of patient, where infection in every unit, whether it's in Birmingham or Barts, doesn't matter, will develop infections. And quite often, sometimes those infections are caused by organisms which are environmental in their nature. And it's unavoidable because of the extremely vulnerable nature of the patient.
And if we stay with environmentally nature, organisms on your environmentally relevant list. When I say environmental, that's what I'm meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
So if we stay with environmentally relevant organisms, am I right in thinking that would mean that in any particular hospital unit that's dealing with these sort of patients, you would expect to have some infections in that group caused because of gut translocation, coming on the skin, and those sort of things?
And
maybe on the environment as well.
And in the environment, because I think it's pretty near impossible it is impossible to produce a hematology oncology ward that has no organisms in it. It will have environmental organisms.
In a sense, what you mean is, although would you accept the idea that the ambition is to have no organisms and no infections, but there will inevitably be some, and that is what you mean by the normal level of risk?
Yes, yeah.
In this next sentence, I've already asked you about the reference to whole genome sequencing, but there was in the first second sentence a reference to an increase beyond the normally expected number of infections due to a specific bacterium. Now, I take it that's a reference to the National Infection Prevention Control Manual and the data exceedance.
Yes, and I'm more familiar with the UK, but also with, as I'm an academic clinician, with the academic definitions of outbreak, and one's debated it over the years. But in broadly, it falls in line with obviously what Health Protection Scotland regards an outbreak, as we've just discussed previously.
would you accept that for some bacterium in the pediatric hemato-oncology cohort, there will be bacterium where any infections is beyond the normally expected numbers?
Oh, that's quite difficult.
Before you answer it, let me explain why I asked it.
Yeah, okay.
So we've had a lot of evidence from people who were involved in the clinical and infection prevention control and microbiology teams in this hospital, in the pediatric unit, in 17, 18, 19, who describe when they saw a particular bacterium saying variations on the theme of, I've never seen it before, I had to go and look it up, it's so rare, we've not had it here before. And in that context, many of those people, particularly focusing on the microbiologists, have said, we wouldn't expect to get any of these. So in that context, would you ever have bacterium for which the normally expected number is, to all intents and purposes, 0?
I think that's difficult because you cannot take the case of cuprovidus. It's a very rare cause of infection in neutropenics in comparison to the amount of cuprovidus everyone meets.
Yes.
Okay, so we see a cuprovidus in a ward. Okay, we can find cuprovidus obviously in every tap and in all the water supply because it's one of those organisms which seems to survive and be distributed. Does it mean that patient acquired it from that ward because we've seen it in that ward? No.
Well, that wasn't
at home.
That wasn't the question I was asking.
Okay,
it was just focusing on this specific detail point, and I perhaps wouldn't have thought of cuprovidus as the example. But are there any bacterium in this environmentally relevant group for whom any number of infections would be an increase beyond the normal?
Yes, I mean all of them in a sense, even more common ones. If in your unit, I don't know, you see, shall we say, 10 Stenotrophomonas a year for argument's sake, and then you go through a period where suddenly you've now seen in a month, you've seen 5 cases of Stenotrophomonas. That is abnormal and therefore requires some degree of investigation.
An example that has been frequently referred to in this inquiry is Mycobacterium chelonae.
Yes, I thought you might refer to that.
Yes, so we know of a case, not actually in the pediatric hemato-oncology ward, but in one of its patients in 2018, another case in 2019 after the decant. We've actually found reference in blood samples to a 2016 case as well. Now, you get the impression, well, more than the impression, the evidence of those involved in treating that case is that it meets this definition of something where any infections is beyond the normally expected numbers. Are you comfortable with people talking about it in that way?
Yes, to a degree, because again, it is an organism. If you look at its biology, it is immensely widely spread in the environment, rather like cuprovidus, a very different organism to cuprovidus. It's so widely spread. It is in almost all wet sites. If you look, you'll find Mycobacterium chelonae. In medical terms, it's come to fame not in this context, in compromised patients, but a major problem in heart bypass machines, because the intercooler was used water, plain water, and was open to the atmosphere in the theatre. And people didn't realise you've got heavy colonisation of the intercooler, which was open to the atmosphere, and you could generate an aerosol, which then would contaminate surfaces and contaminate the patient's heart valve, and they develop a terrible infection.
Right.
That's where I see Mycobacterium chelonae more frequently, although now we've prevented that.
Now, there's another concept which has been talked about, the concept of a normal level of infections. And I wonder if there's any concerns you have about using that phraseology, as opposed to a normal level of risk or a normal infection specific organism, but a normal level of infections for the whole class of environmentally relevant.
Again, it comes, what do you regard as normal? Well, in some institutions, you may have a very low level, and they may be doing things in a particular way, because we're talking real world here, where they get their level down to a much lower level than another organisation, which may or may not be taking those same precautions. And the point is, I think, is that you've got to look at it as a whole organisation. It's the way in which the team are operating, the infection control, management of lines, the cleaning of things, the engineering, as we know, which obviously this inquiry has spent a lot, quite rightly, a lot of time looking at. They're all different. So when we say a normal level, I'm slightly uneasy because what level are we going to accept? And what is that level? And how heavy is it? How high is it? And also, how does it relate to another similar unit?
Sorry,
How does it relate to another similar unit? Have they got half the rate? Or maybe they've got double the rate and you're really doing rather well.
To what extent is the question really, has there been a real change?
I think that's very important. It's trends that we're looking at. And that's where our data in HAD did show, yes, at this particular period there was an increase, but there was also an increase in gram positives, which I think was the one thing we brought in HAD. We've now dissected that more carefully.
We're going to come back to that, in the afternoon.
But that's where trend was very important to us. I think
Right.
all of us, all three of us.
What I'd like to do is to deal with what I have called antibiotic resistance, but what Dr. Agarwal has encouraged me to call antibiotic prescribing as a topic.
Yes.
Can I?
Of course, Mark.
With apologies. If this is too superficial, just tell me. What I've taken from your previous answers is trying to deal with this concept of what is normal. You make the point that what is normal in one unit maybe not normal in another unit. Now, is it too superficial to say that if not the best people to ask as to whether there has been a change, at least very important people to ask are the clinicians dealing with a specific cohort of patients in a specific unit?
Yes, the clinicians are important, but also it's important that that organisation has a facility to collect and collate all of those serious infections, identify the organisms, and again, you've seen evidence for it, things like exceedance limits. So, maybe you only get one Pseudomonas every month, and suddenly you've got 5. So that really falls more into the remit of infection control, particularly, who say, gosh, looks like we've got a problem. But then obviously important to talk to clinicians when you try and understand why we've got this sudden occurrence. Because it can be random. It can be a random event, a stochastic event.
Thank you.
So I want to talk about antibiotic prescribing. Now, you deal with this in a number of different places in the report.
Yes.
And actually, probably the best place to look, I think, might be chapter 4 when you're discussing the CNR. And what we might do is talk a bit in general and see if we need to go anywhere else. So I wonder if we can go to page 45. Now, page 45 of volume 1 of bundle 44 is part of chapter 4. It's
right.
Towards the end, in fact, if you take out the whole page here, please zoom right out.
Yeah.
That paragraph there, so the last word in chapter 4 is approach at the bottom of the page.
Okay,
so you've got
that.
Context there. I want to zoom in on the second last paragraph, the one that starts at 2017 to 18.
Okay, yes.
Now, I'm not going to ask you that question yet, but that's just where we're coming to. So we can take that off the screen. You do seem to be asking the question of what role did antibiotic resistance play in these events? What was the evidence that you had available to you about what was actually going on in terms of antibiotic prescribing and resistance in the Schehallien unit in 15 to 22?
And when we were considering the HAD report, writing the HAD report, very little in terms of that.
Right.
So did you have any information?
I don't recollect.
Did you have some policies?
Can't remember.
The reason I asked that is because we asked the health board when we took you over to provide us with the material that they had given to you, and they explained that a workspace had been created, which my team refers to as the data dump, and it contains a lot of files.
Yes, a lot.
Now, many of them contain Chi numbers, and a lot of them are, of course, Dr. Agarwal's imaging reports, and therefore we haven't put them in bundles. But we put a list of them in volume 2. Sorry, not in volume 2, in volume 1 of the HAD report on page 224. I don't worry, I'm not about to take you through it. But I'm just saying that for the completion of anyone making notes. Now, the reason that within that list is a list of policies to do with antibiotic prescribing.
Yeah.
And for adults and children. Or should we assume that you have those available to you when you wrote these parts of the report?
Yes, I don't remember them being exceptionally different from ones I'm familiar with other units.
And if we go to page 45, which was on the screen before, of volume 44, bundle 44, volume 1, you describe in the middle of a discussion about, I think, Stenotrophomonas.
Yes.
In 2017 to 18, there was a worldwide shortage of piperacillin?
Piperacillin. Yeah.
Tazobactam.
Correct.
Does that have a brand name?
Tazocin.
Tazocin.
Very heavily used antibiotic, particularly in neutropenic patients as a first-line treatment.
Which resulted in many units switching to carbapenem antibiotics. And would one of the carbapenems be meropenem?
That is the market leader. Most people would use meropenem because it's cheap and off patent.
Yes, and then you discuss piperacillin tazobactam was used in the unit for empirical therapy of neutropenic sepsis and was therefore substituted by meropenem. I'm assuming that sentence would have its origin in the policies you'd read.
Yes.
Because you wouldn't have reviewed medical records or prescribing actual numbers.
I can't remember. We did ascertain that there was some increase, but not a great increase, I think, in meropenem use.
So what would have been your source of...
Oh, I honestly can't.
It's just you don't mention it in your report.
No, I mean, this whole concept came as part of my own personal clinical practice in Birmingham, where we had a large BMT unit, and we experienced this shortage, and we switched to using not exclusively meropenem, but a lot of meropenem. And 2 or 3, maybe a little longer months into that situation, we began to see serious infections caused by Stenotrophomonas. And Stenotrophomonas amongst environmental bacteria is a little unusual in that it is always resistant to meropenem. And meropenem is an antibiotic which kills an awful lot of different bacteria, including quite a lot of the environmentals. And we saw this increase. You can never actually tie it down to, well, this patient had meropenem, that one didn't, because they cross-colonize each other, etc. But we then took steps to remove or massively reduce our use of meropenem. We used a different antibiotic, temacillin, with another antibiotic, and we saw a decrease in the Stenotrophomonas infections. So, in a sense, that's my personal experience.
Answer that. I wonder if we can look at the CNR rebuttal document.
Yeah.
Which is bundle 44, volume 5, page 151. No, that's definitely wrong. 44, volume 5. No, volume 2, sorry. Volume 2. There we are. 151.
151, okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, do you see at the bottom of the page?
Yep.
The CNR panel say, we had access to all versions of the policy guiding the use of antibiotics for febrile neutropenia, missing out the brackets, in pediatric hematology oncology patients issued from August 10 to March 20. There is no significant change across the 4 versions of the policy issued at the time. Each specified tazocin over the page and gentamicin as first-line antibiotic therapy for suspected infection, with the addition of vancomycin and, can you pronounce that for me?
Tazobactam? Oh, sorry, where are we at?
The second line.
Second line, it's vancomycin and teicoplanin.
Teicoplanin, if there was a concern about infection in the central line. And meropenem was to be substituted for tazocin if there was a persistent fever at 72 hours. Now, would you accept that There was no change in the policy in practical terms.
No change in the policy, but practically, many hospitals, no, most hospitals, were unable to obtain piperacillin tazobactam and therefore made up an ad hoc policy usually, and we did in Birmingham.
So I appreciate what we did in Birmingham, but
Yeah,
do you know what they did in this hospital?
not in great detail.
Do you know that it's the evidence of Professor Gibson, who headed the unit, that there was no shortage, they were not affected, they were fully protected?
That's very pleasing to hear.
But you didn't know that?
I didn't know that.
Right. Can we
I
take you...
didn't have a witness statement or statement from Professor Gibson.
Well, just a moment, before you say that. Professor Gibson gave evidence at this inquiry before your report was finished.
Okay.
And we've asked her again about it in response to your report.
Mm-hmm.
What steps did you take to inquire of the people who instructed you, that is Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, of what was actually done in this unit at the time?
Well, we asked to ask it, was there a change in usage? And they came back and said there didn't appear to be much of a change in usage.
Right. So there wasn't a change in policy and there wasn't a change in usage.
Mm.
Can I show you a report prepared for the paediatric hemato-oncology consultants in August 2018?
Right.
In the middle, well, not the middle, towards the end, just after decant. So it's bundle 19, document 19, page 143. This is the document you hadn't seen before. But this was prepared by Dr. Peters, who was then microbiologist for that team, and Ms. Harvey Wood, who's given evidence twice, clinical scientist, and a pharmacist who hasn't given evidence. Now, what I wanted to do was to look at the aim of this report. So this was prepared at the time. Do you see the second bullet point? To determine antibiotic resistance rates.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
I can take you to page 161 and step out a little bit so we can see the whole chart. We've had a lot of evidence about this from its authors and from Professor Gibson. So if I understand correctly, the vertical purple bars are the total environmental orgs by their definition.
Okay, well, that's a very broad sweeping statement.
It is, but that's not the purpose of the chart.
No, okay.
And then that, I think, is just to provide context.
Okay.
But the actual chart contains, do you see how it contains 3 single color lines?
Yep.
One for each of 3 types of antibiotic. And then below that, dotted lines or for the number of organisms who are resistant to these antibiotics. So, for example, if we look at meropenem, just to put it into context, the line for the prescribing of meropenem in 2015 February just comes up below the 400 line on the...
I mean, 4 in terms of the number of blood cultures positive with a resistant organism, if we're talking resistance. Are we talking resistance?
Well, at the moment, I'm just making sure that you can read the chart. So,
yes, I can just.
So the meropenem prescribing comes to 400 DDDs antibiotics in February 2015. Do you see that?
2015.
It's got the yellow line.
Yeah, got it. Yes, there we are. Yeah.
And if we look down below that, we see that the number of blood cultures, this is not a rate, this is a number, is 1 for the meropenem resistant environmental gram negatives at that point, i.e. February 15. Do you see that there?
Yeah, got it, yes.
And then if we were to look at tazocin, it has a blue line and blue dots, and there are no infections in February 15. And then for, I can never pronounce what Cipro will be.
Ciprofloxacin.
Ciprofloxacin, thank you, Professor. Ciprofloxacin has a rate of just over 200 DDs in February 15 and no infections. Do you see that?
When we say no,
it's right along the bottom of the chart. You see,
no resistance.
No resistance at all. Yeah. Right, now, what I'm not asking you to conduct analysis of this now.
No.
But it does appear that in October 2018, various people carried out this analysis, and I will take you to the conclusions page, which is on page 166. And they've reached certain conclusions.
Yeah.
Now, and then over the page, on 167, they reach overall summary of results. The overall conclusions are 167. And what I'm wondering here is, what do we do as an inquiry? We have your text in which you have expressed your concerns based on your experience. And we have contemporaneous records of an investigation which appears to, and we are told by its authors and by others, have excluded antibiotic resistance as a factor. And in fact, if you go and look at page, I missed out a chart to show you. At page 162, a nice clear chart of meropenem use divided by the number of gram-negative bacteremias. The peak, if there is one, is in 2015 before they moved to the new hospital.
That's an unusual way of presenting the data.
No, I think that's a fair point. I think the author did say that. But the point I was just going to putting to you is, what do we do as an inquiry when faced with people at the time who say, we looked into this, it wasn't an issue. Now, they might have been wrong, I get that, but they did at the time. And you, who tell us we should look for things without any contemporary evidence, who do we listen to?
Well, I wasn't trying to prove, I don't think at any point we said, this is why you saw an increase in Stenotrophomonas. We said, actually, this might be a factor and needs looking at, basically. It's a possible explanation. Right. And I take all your points, and I don't think meropenem usage can be accounted for as causing any apparent rise in Stenotrophomonas. There is another antibiotic on that chart, if we can go back to it.
Yes, of course, page 161. Yes.
Which is interesting. And that is the line for the usage of ciprofloxacin.
Yes, it is.
Yes, which is used, I think you'll have heard from Dr. Agrawal, as a prophylactic agent.
Yes.
The problem with a prophylactic agent, I think Agrawal touched on this, is that it can select for much more resistant organisms. The very reason why at Barts they don't use ciprofloxacin prophylaxis. And what I see here is a marked increase, a huge increase in usage of ciprofloxacin. So I could put it to you that actually maybe excessive use of ciprofloxacin is influencing what we're seeing here. Well, Not saying it's proven, but I think it's something to think about.
Well, indeed, I'd like your help in thinking about it. So if we look at this chart and put it into context. Do you see how the final entry from this October 2018 report appears to be February 2018?
Yes, second. Oh, those are quarters, I think.
They might be quarters. You're right. So I'm wrong. It's the end of June. End of June 2018. Now, we are told, and I don't think there's any doubt about this, that the water incident begins in March 2018.
Okay.
And that there is some anxiety in January, February, and March. And you, of course, have now produced a HAD chart, which Dr. Drumwright described as having a peak in the first few months of 2018.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether, obviously we can't tell what's happening on the right-hand side of this chart any further, because it doesn't go any further. But it would be quite difficult for ciprofloxacin to be causing the growth, any such growth there was, in organisms prior to the peak of its use.
No, because actually, you've got to remember these patients are not just instantly treated, they're not short-term treatments. Some of them go over relatively long periods.
No, I must have misasked the question, because either I've got the wrong question or you've misunderstood me.
I probably misunderstood the question.
We are told by, amongst other people, that there is a growth in the environmentally relevant infections between the middle of 16, which we can see where that is on the chart, and January, February 18. Dr. Drumwright's very keen us to be a bit soft about that time.
Yes.
And then it drops away.
Yes.
Now, there is a peak of ciprofloxacin in Q1 of 2018.
There is indeed, yes.
How does that peak cause the growth in infections beforehand?
in the sense, the only thing I can hypothesize, and this is purely
I understand that.
hypothesis, is that in taking the quinolone, you select more resistant organisms. Now, those resistant organisms may not
Sorry,
cause
could you just repeat
sorry.
that?
In taking the ciprofloxacin, it's an oral drug, and a number of the sort of gram negatives we're talking about in this context are very often resistant to ciprofloxacin.
Yeah.
Drugs, the organisms like Stenotrophomonas, but also Klebsiellas can develop resistance, and Enterobacter. So I'm just wondering, and you won't see an immediate effect. So I'm wondering actually, why are they increasing the usage of ciprofloxacin? That's question number one. Is it for prophylaxis? It seems it most probably is. Have they got more patients? Have they got more sick patients? Are the patients sicker for longer? Are questions I would be asking.
Why didn't you?
Sorry?
Why didn't you?
I didn't see this chart.
No, but you're investigating. You raise antibiotic resistance as a possibility, and yet you don't inquire as to what's happened.
Okay, it was a failing in that sense.
Because we now have to investigate it. So
No, sure, yeah.
So the reason I was slightly snappy with Dr. Agrawal when he raised this is because he hadn't put it in the report.
No,
And I've now got to work out how to investigate this.
sure.
And I'm doing that months after people who were there have given evidence. And so that's why I'm wondering why you didn't investigate this, the whole concept, by saying, I'm interested in this topic of antibiotic resistance. I know it's a problem. Why don't I find out what happened?
To a certain extent, limitation of time.
Right.
Spent a lot of time on this. There limits what I can do.
I wonder if I can show you a document. I'd just like to understand.
Well, unless it's staying on this point, I think there's maybe three things that interest me at the moment. First of all, I wasn't entirely sure if Professor, you and Mr. McIntosh were engaging simply on the point of time,
Right.
because I think what was being put to you was that if we assume that the chart is our best information on when things are happening, what I think was being put to you was that there was an increase in infections which were noticed and were a matter of concern by about March of 2018, whereas, depends exactly on how you maybe read the chart, the peak for meropenem, for ciprofloxacin use looks to be subsequent to that. Now, I just wondered if you and Mr. That's my first concern. I just wondered if you and Mr. McIntosh were actually engaging on that.
Are we? I would check we're on the same page here. So,
okay.
Let's recap. You are positing that we should consider whether ciprofloxacin prescribing levels in the first quarter of 2018 might subsequently cause resistant organisms to prosper.
Could be an association.
Right.
It's an unusual finding to see that sudden peak.
Yes, and that would be something we would see in the nature of the organisms that were growing after that date.
Yes, and in fact, you could test that fairly quickly if you've got. Well, you will have access to the sensitivity test, the antibiotic sensitivity testing data of these organisms. Did they see more ciprofloxacin resistant organisms? Because resistance to ciprofloxacin usually arises by a mutational process.
Right.
So your organism in your gut, sensitive, you start taking ciprofloxacin, and then at some undefined point during taking it, it develops resistant, and now it's resistant, which is not a very typical mechanism of resistance development for other antibiotics.
Right. When it comes to meropenem, am I thinking that your position is, well, you now see they've investigated it, and so in a sense it's not an issue?
It's not an issue,
right.
I don't think.
Right. I'll just mention the 2 points while we're at it.
Yes.
We may have heard evidence about this, but it would seem fairly uncontroversial that one possible explanation of an increased use of ciprofloxacin is a concern among clinicians about an apparent increase in infection, which has got to be dealt with one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
The other point is maybe a bit more fundamental. In the HAD report, there are lots of pieces of information, and I want to take the best, or make the best use of it as I can. It's not always clear to me why the information is there. But if we take the example of what you say about antibiotic resistance, you raise the possibility of specifically the resistance as a result of the discriminating effect of meropenem. But you just leave the possibility, notwithstanding the fact that, as we've established, it would have been open to you and your colleagues to make inquiry of, for example, the pharmacy in the Queen Elizabeth, as to whether, in fact, what was a possibility was actually the fact. And had you done so, again, if I understand the evidence, you would have been able to eliminate that possibility. But in the HAD report, the possibility is left hanging.
Yes.
Now, would you accept that as a criticism of the way this aspect, at least, of the HAD report has been put together?
Yes, it's valid criticism.
Right.
I want to just one topic particularly. I'd clear up something that I showed to Dr. Agarwal and Dr. Drumright, but they couldn't help me.
Right.
If we go to Bundle 44, Volume 1, Document 7, at page 248. Now, I'm going to first ask you whether you've seen this document before.
Gosh.
Maybe it would help you if I just step on to page 249. You'll see the graphical treatment
Let's have a look at
chart.
that.
249. So there's a lot of these. So if we go back to 248, it seems to be top of that page, in fact. Just go to the top of that page. Seems to be a report by someone called Sean McBride Stewart, dated from end of January last year. It's in the folder we were given by the Central Legal Office on behalf of Greater Glasgow. It's accompanied by an email, which I'm not going to put on the screen, to somebody in the legal team attaching it. And it has various pieces of information about use of antimicrobial agents. And I wondered if you'd seen this before you wrote your report.
Not familiar with it, no.
Well, in that case, I'll take it off the screen. Okay.
But it looks very useful.
Well, indeed, and it just turned up in the folder. We haven't used it yet. I want to turn to the topic of whole genome sequencing.
Right.
Now, I'm going to have to sort of remind you that whilst I would like to think and I'm sure this is the case with Lordship, we are intrigued and interested people who want to understand. I think I speak for myself and for His Lordship that we're not technically trained in the field of genetic microbiology. And bearing that in mind, I'm going to put some things to you, and I'm very keen for you to tell me if I've got them wrong, but I would encourage you to do that in a way that keeps it short as you can, at a level that we can understand. Now, we've had a lot of people give evidence that whole genome sequencing can prove a connection between two samples, either to an environmental sample and a sterile sample from a patient, to environmental samples or two sterile samples, by analysing them and working how closely related the organisms are, and they measure it in something called SNPs.
Yes,
I've got that right.
Polymorphism. Yeah.
And so it's entirely uncontroversial as far as we can see.
Yes, that
you can prove a connection.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, a witness, Professor Dancer, gave evidence last year.
Oh, yeah, Stephanie Dancer.
So Stephanie Dancer gave evidence, and she almost set this up as a principle. She didn't quite phrase it this way, but it comes across the way she talks about it as a principle, that when you are looking in the environment to find the source of a particular infection, when you find a whole genome sequencing match, you say, I found the source, that's the end, I stop. But when I can't find the close connection, I keep looking.
Yes.
And it seemed to be her position, and that's a number of other witnesses, that therefore that one works on the basis that whole genome sequencing can't prove the absence of a link between a sample in patient A and patient B. And that seems to turn on the meaning of some words. And that's what I want to ask you about. So I've sort of set that up as, that wasn't the question, it was sort of, you see where I'm coming from.
Absolutely, yes.
Right, so if we play hypotheticals and we imagine we have a sink or a water cooler in a unit with very vulnerable patients, and two of them get the same microorganism, and you examine the samples and they are genetically almost identical, you'd agree that is that's
a very important finding. Yeah.
And if you went and found a sample from the water cooler,
And it
you've
matched.
got it.
That would be
great. And if you extend that logic to a sink, the same would be true.
Yes.
Right. Now, if we change the scenario slightly, it's still a sink, but there's no sample, and there's a sample from the sink, and there's a sample from a patient, but they don't match. Would you say that that would enable you to exclude the sink as the source of the infection for that patient?
No, you can't. You can't exclude it
Right.
at all on those, just for those two data points.
Yes.
What one might see is if you've got this increased incidence, shall we say,
Yes.
of organisms, of this particular species that you're typing,
Yes.
and you see that there are two scenarios. You'll get lots of different types, unrelated,
same species.
amongst the same species in the bloodstream infections. So we've got, say, 10 people get septicemia with Stenotrophomonas, and they're all different. So we could say, aha, yes, that's probably not due to the environment. Well, difficult, because it may be some of those patients have acquired it from the environment, and we haven't found the one in the environment. But what you do tend to see in outbreak reports in hematology.
My fault entirely. I'm just because I'm
please
keen,
interrupt me,
keen
because
to
I'm
follow
using
the
words
step
I'm familiar with, and I'm aware your
the,
lordship may not have met them.
Sorry, we're thinking of a hypothesis. 6 or 7 patients have acquired an infection with Stenotrophomonas.
Yep.
One does carry out
Genome sequencing.
a typing analysis and finds a number of strains.
Yeah.
Now, I think you then said that excludes the environment, or excludes the environment in certain of these strains. Now, I don't follow that step.
Well, the reason being, if one then goes on to look at situations where we do people have identified a source, an environmental source, you not infrequently, in many of those accounts, see that there is, although you get different types, a type keeps on popping up, the same type. Do you see what I mean? Because when we go into the environment, we will find at least 1 or 2 different types, maybe more subtypes of Stenotrophomonas, for argument's sake. Okay? And you've not seen them in the patient. If you like, the patients are sort of sampling the environment, but the problem is you can't be an absolute proof one way or the other. So the hypothesis being put forward, I think, by some people is that, well, okay, we look at all these bloodstream infections, they're all unrelated. So that means we've just not found the holy grail of the type we found in the patient's blood in a sink because we didn't look hard enough.
Yes.
And there are elements of that I would agree with, because the investigation of the whole genome sequencing and the sampling was somewhat erratic, I think it would be fair to say. And I think other people, including the CNR, and I would agree with the CNR, it was not ideal. They didn't always know which sample it came, what site it came from, whether they were all. But I did note my interpretation of what I could understand from the reports on the WGS is it seemed that a lot, maybe not every, certainly not every, a lot of the bloodstream isolates, just for Klebsiella, group of Vitis, but the numbers are very small, but also Enterobacter, they did do typing on a lot of the clinical isolates that may or may not have been absolutely in the period we're interested in. And they were all different. Doesn't prove they didn't get it from the environment. Some of those probably did get it from the environment. But not what we see typically in many other outbreaks, including one that Mr. McIntosh has seen the paper of, the Najadi paper.
I'm going to come to those in a moment.
If you're going to come to that's fine. Where they did eventually see and identify a definite source for this one type.
So just because I'm trying to...
I wonder if I can sort of take advantage and just
please
understanding the, as it were, the nature of the challenge. In now, question one: is there any theoretical limit in the number of strains of, let's say, Stenotrophomonas that one might find in a hospital in Scotland?
In practical terms, if you look at the literature, you won't find sort of 30 different strains in one sink. I think that's highly improbable. What most people find, again, there's a piece of work done in Oxford, which the CNR group refer to, which is a very nice piece of work where they intensively looked at the traps in 3 different wards over a time period, and not only whole genome sequence, every one of their E. coli and Klebsiella they could get out there. And interestingly, they found that certain traps and certain sinks in certain wards had a long-term resident.
Right. Maybe I didn't put my question very well. First of all, as a matter of total principle, is there any limit on, because I understand bacteria are relatively simple organism compared with other organisms,
absolutely.
but that doesn't mean they're not highly complex.
Yeah.
But is there any limit in principle on the capacity of a particular bacterial species to differentiate into strains?
Oh, yes, very much so. And that's where we see evolutionary trees. And in fact, Stenotrophomonas is an example of a bacterial type which is very diverse. It produces a lot of different clades, and they've diverged in their evolution a long while ago. So there's other types of bacteria we see sometimes, which are really very, very narrow in their evolutionary route, particularly in relation to sort of human infection. And some types of E. coli would fit with that. So because it's an organism which is widespread in the environment, not necessarily the hospital environment, when you look at traps and situations there, you will find quite a lot of different types. And the whole genome sequencing did find that for Stenotrophomonas. Doesn't mean some of those can't be a source. And it's my opinion that some of those trap Stenotrophomonas did get into patients in all probability.
Right. I'll try this again.
Yeah.
We've been introduced to the notion of looking for a needle in a haystack.
Yes.
I'm just trying to see if I understand the size of the haystack. Thus far, as I've understood you, some species will have many variants, types.
Subtypes.
Yeah. We'll have many. Some species will have less, but are we talking about tens, hundreds, thousands?
Well, the thing about whole genome sequencing is, so we can distinguish these, if you like, families that have evolved rather than that. But within those families, when you get down to what Mr. McIntosh was talking about, SNPs, We can then get very, very detailed about a collection of strains living within that little family. And if we find they're only 5 to 10 SNPs different, then we know genetically they must have come from a common source. They must be very, very recently.
Yeah, I think I've understood that. Right. The other very basic point is that, am I right in understanding that if you're taking your samples from the environment, the bacterial population of a particular location may be different, may be very different from a location which is in close proximity to that?
Yes, that's quite possible, and particularly applies to sink traps. I mean, see, there's almost a hierarchy here. We've been talking about biofilm on taps and ingressive contamination and retrograde contamination. That's in a sense, I won't say simpler, but it's not such a nice environment for the bacteria to proliferate and produce biofilm, because it's a very small area, that interface between air and the tap body. A sink trap is a lovely place because it's always wet, and you've got nutrients there. And what's more is it gets complicated because various types of bacteria are being flushed down the sink. So when people wash their hands or put things they shouldn't put down the sink, such as some human sample, but urine. I'm not saying people do that regularly, but it's a much more open environment. So you do see quite a big population, and studies show that.
Right. And it seems to follow from that where you carry out your sample is of importance.
It is. And the other thing to consider is that there's lots of these bacteria around, but they can sit there and not be a problem if you don't have a route of transmission back into the patient. And that's the key point. And that, in the Najadi study, which we'll come back to anyway, they interrupted. They didn't clean up all their traps at all. In fact, they went back to a more inferior method of disinfecting their traps. What they did is they interrupted the route of transmission, end of outbreak with their Stenotrophomonas.
Thank you. I suspect I've really just interrupted without...
No, I'm grateful, Malone. I'm going to move away from principles.
Right.
Well, before I do that, I'll just take one concept. Am I missing? Should I actually be using the word homogeneous in these sentences? So when I put to you that the absence of a virtually identical bacteria between two sterile samples in two separate patients proves they don't come from a homogeneous source. Is that a sentence?
Hang on, I just need to go through that. So we're talking sterile samples.
Two sterile samples, same bacteria.
Blood samples,
Blood
right.
samples.
Two different types of organism.
No, the same bacteria species.
Oh, the same species and type, WGS type?
Well, we'll come into that first.
Okay,
Just same species first. You do analysis, they're within tens of SNPs. You can then say they come from the same source.
It's very suggestive.
Very suggestive that.
Yes.
They're not within tens of SNPs. They're a long way apart.
Yeah.
I've seen articles and you've quoted things, and I'm wondering, and it's not exactly your words, I don't put them straight to you, but could it be that in the absence of a close relationship between the two samples, what you can actually say is that they don't come from a homogeneous source?
They don't come from what we would use the term common source.
So the common source is a particular bacteria, single bacteria.
Well, no, the common source is shall we say, as you were saying, in this context, it's a disinfectant solution, shall we say, that's become contaminated on board, got lots of Stenotrophomonas in it. But if they're different types, then it's unlikely they're coming from that single common source.
Right. So I'm getting the impression, and I want you to stop me if I've got this wrong,
right,
that in this discussion of single common sources, what we're thinking about is something that at some point has been quite small. It might have been spread across the hospital in a cleaning solution, but it started off little because it's a little community of bacteria.
True. Yeah.
And So what I would like to explore with you before the lunch break is, I don't see it as worth pressing you about the example that you can go and look at. You can look at a study that has examined a single sink or a couple of sinks or a water filter, and you can see that the organisms aren't closely related, and you can say, probably not that water filter. That doesn't seem controversial.
No, I think that's right. Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yep.
But absent the aseptic pharmacy of 2016, the hypothesis that has been put to us, that we're sent investigating, is that it's not one water filter, it's not one sink. It is a lot of locations throughout the hospital, which are reaching patients through multiple sources, taps, showers, drinking water, and so forth.
Well, these types of organisms, you talk the whole hospital, meaning in general medical and surgical wards, you won't be picking these up
No,
because
but it doesn't mean they're not there.
oh, they're there.
Yeah.
They're in my own hospital. All of my hospital
Exactly.
things have got them in. It's the location. It's, if you like, the hematology oncology.
No, I understand the location point about,
Yeah.
it's about the whole genome sequencing. So
Right.
the thought is this, and this is what I'd like you to explain to me in a sense why this proposition is not correct. That if you have a community of vulnerable patients in a hospital, they might meet the water system in a number of different ways. They'll meet it through taps, through showers, through drinking water, through things that have been cleaned with water from the taps and showers, from spray, from taps and sinks.
Yeah.
They might meet the drains from spray from the drains if they're badly designed.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. They might meet all these things in their own room, in their own ward, operating theatre, imaging location, or anywhere in the hospital they end up being. Do you accept that's all possibility? And therefore, if you have a handful of Stenotrophomonas patients who have the Stenotrophomonas species found in their blood, but of widely different genetic connection, they're not closely relatives, what is to stop you thinking, well, they don't come from the same small sample, the disinfectant, the one sink, the water sample, but given they're in different rooms, they might actually come from multiple different locations. So one could have got it from the tap in their room, one could have got it from the shower in their room, one could have got it from another tap down in X-ray, the fourth could have got it from home, the fifth could have got it from the fact they've been previously colonized. And actually, because it's possible that each individual patient can have a completely different route to get the infection, whole genome sequencing does not exclude that.
No, it doesn't exclude it. It also, in practical terms, we know, again from studies and the literature, that one of the most common ways in which people acquire these organisms isn't necessarily from the environment itself or directly from the environment, but from another patient who is colonized.
Indeed.
And most units in the UK don't generally do extensive colonization studies on these vulnerable patients.
Right, I want to pick out one topic about, in general terms, it's about something you say on page 121 of volume 44, volume 1. It's a reference to the 121, reference to a reasonable sample. Now, I'm just going to make sure I've got the right page because it'd be a terrible shame to put the wrong page to you.
Yes, I can see it there, yes.
Yeah, you can see it there. It's the second paragraph from the bottom.
Yeah.
However, a reasonable sample have been sequenced. Now, I recognise we're going to have a conversation after lunch about Professor Evans's individual pieces of work and Professor Leonard's work and what you draw from those. But it occurred to me that I should press you on this idea of a reasonable sample.
Yes, and this comes back to a little bit of what I said a little bit earlier, that it's my understanding. I may have got the understanding wrong as far as I could tell, and I am aware that the documentation of source of isolates, and I haven't seen a list of isolate names and how that relates to when they were isolated, and there seems to be a little bit of haziness as to whether these samples were there. So the ones I felt had perhaps in terms of the environmental location, and also there was intensive sampling, and then there was very little sampling, and then there was sampling from tanks in the roof. But what we did get typed seemed to me to be a reasonable number of the positive blood cultures with those two organisms we talked about.
So how do you know it's a reasonable number?
Because the CNR very helpfully charts by each year how many isolates they had, they perceived in their bacteremia isolates of all of the different organisms. And then in turn, I think this is something that Dr. Drumright did. She did look back at those totals as presented in the CNR charts and her understanding of how many cases of BSI there were on 2017 on the relevant ward.
So, because we have some evidence from Professor Wilcox.
Right.
So if we think about the Cenotrophomonas that were whole genome sequenced, and we go to actually look at Professor Evans's paper, so that's bundle 8, document 46, starts at page 239. 239.
Not there.
239. Yes. Now,
Okay.
This is obviously the beginning of the paper. I wonder if we can just step over to page 242. And do you see in the paragraph 3.2, there we are, the last sentence.
Last sentence.
Of 3.2, over this time period, there were 23 isolates of clinical relevance isolated from blood cultures.
And we're talking stenotrophomonas.
Yes, this is the steno paper.
Piece. Yeah. Okay.
Now, the problem is that Professor Wilcox has explained to us. Now, he seems to have had this from Professor Leonard.
Right.
That of those 23, only 15 are from within the CNR cohort.
Okay, so I did look at this and I couldn't understand where he got
this is the problem.
Statement. I just couldn't see it.
So I think, slightly reading between the lines, he can do this for two reasons. One, because he tells me he's been told that by Professor Leonard, albeit he told that after Professor Leonard gave evidence, so that is a slight snag. But the second problem is that he has access to the individual patient medical records.
Of course, yeah.
And so he can connect the samples in the SNP charts that Evans and Leonard has to his records. Now, we can't do that.
And I can't do it. No.
Exactly. And so what I'm worried about is I know that I need to be nervous about using any time someone like Professor Wilcox says, we looked at it and we concluded X, but I can't show you my working because of the confidentiality rules around the CNR.
And I found that difficult as well.
Yeah, indeed. So I know to be nervous at that point. But sadly, doesn't it also mean that you're at a bit of a disadvantage? Because whilst you've got the Evans-Leonard's work, you don't have the context.
Yeah.
And so I'm worried that when you make statements like there's a reasonable sample taken, how do you know that?
But because I read the Leonard, I may have misinterpreted it, but I read that report as in the way I did read it.
Yes.
And those. Okay, so Professor Wilcox can now say 23 in his opinion, and I have to take that, were relevant to this time period and were from blood cultures. My next question would be, what's the denominator? So in the period he's talking about, how many, if you like, didn't get WGS? I don't know. I just can't do the calculation quickly.
Well, no, I see
need
that.
to look at.
I see that, but the difficulty is, and this goes back to a comment that you make in the response document, where I think probably ought to find it. I think before lunch it might be worth trying to just do this. In fact, no, I thought, Maud, I think I'll do it straight afterwards. So I'll just remind you so you can look yourself. I have a recollection, I will pull up the reference, of you commenting on something Professor Wilcox says and suggesting that you talk about burden of proof. So I will go and find that. You might
Okay.
want to look in the response document yourself,
Right.
and we'll speak about it
I,
at 2 o'clock.
I'll need access to that. I don't have my computer with me, and
No,
I
we'll get
don't
you a
have
copy. We'll
Yeah,
get
if
you
you can get me a copy, I'd be very happy to look at it.
Well, we'll take our lunch break now, and we'll try and sit again at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you.